That has got to be one of the most shocking endings to any novel I've read. What did you think? I'm Roger and this is BookShook, and today's podcast is all about the second half of Where the Crawdads Sings by Delia Owens. So the idea of the podcast is that we'll read the first half of a book together, share our thoughts, maybe make a few predictions, and then at the second podcast we'll deal with the second half of the book. We can decide if it's a book worth recommending. Of course, you don't have to read anything at all. If you're into Audible, then you can listen to the book, or you can do neither, of course, and just join me for the ride. I'll be summarising what happens in the book just for you, but be aware there will be spoilers, so I recommend you finish the book before listening. You'd be warned. Welcome to BookShook. So let's just have a quick recap from last podcast. Basically, Patty, the mother of Chase, has just told the police that he was wearing a shell necklace given to him by the, quotes, marsh trash before he got married, but it wasn't around his neck at the coroner's, and so they decide they are going to have to get hold of Kaya to question her. So we start the second part, which I'm starting on chapter 26, called The Boat Ashore. So Chase and Kaya go on a trip to a new area of the marsh, but Chase is not interested in nature at all like Kaya. Tate sees Kaya, and then he decides he does love her. He returns to her cove only to see Kaya and Chase together from a distance, so he backs away. And Kaya resists Chase's sexual advances. Later, Kaya goes to the library in the Sea Oaks, and here she's not the marsh girl. She reads a hilarious article on mating in nature, how weaker bullfrogs sit next to the stronger ones to then get mates. So again, she's learning from nature. Sam and Patty Love, who are Chase's parents, don't warm to her when she bumps into them. Chase and Kaya drive then to Asheville, and Kaya's shocked by the fake plastic nature that she sees all around her, and they make love in a seedy motel, and the love-making makes her feel cold and wanting more. And Chase dissuades her from Christmasing with his family, so she spends it alone, even though she's quite desperate to spend Christmas with some sort of semblance of humanity. It's as if Chase really doesn't want her around. Tate boats in to see Kaya, and he says to her, look, don't trust Chase, because I saw him with another girl, and she reacts really bad to this, but she concedes, and Tate enters her shack, and he sees all these specimens that she's been drawing, and all these artworks, and the specimens she's been collecting. He's amazed by the collection, in fact, and he says, quote, you could publish a book. Quote, once again, Tate was nudging her to care for herself, not just offering to care for her, very much unlike Chase. And then we fast forward to the trial. Hal Miller tells the police informally that he and Alan Hunt saw the marsh girl beyond midnight motoring in her boat towards the fire tower, and Ed and Joe decide that an arrest warrant must be needed. And my own personal thoughts at this time are, I don't believe it for an instant. It wasn't a formal statement. He just told them in a bar, and how could they ever see who it was at the dead of night? Surely it's pitch black, so maybe he's just seen another boat, or it's some kind of frame. Also, I think that Sammy and Patty Love have a motive in this, because they don't like the marsh girl at all. Anyway, we go back in time. Kaya is still seeing Chase, but he sees her in town with his arm draped over another girl, and he's in a group, and she really feels like an outsider. And then she discovers a newspaper article stating that Chase is marrying Pearl, who she knows as always wears pearls. It's quite nice the way that Delia Owens has described the girls that she bumps into. We've got tall, skinny blonde, ponytail, freckle face, short black hair, and round, chubby cheeks, because obviously she doesn't know their names. She's not part of that group, but that's how she thinks of them in her head. In anger, she motorboats into the Rips, which is this sort of dangerous area of the sea. But luckily, a seashell sandbar saves her, causes her to reflect on loneliness, and she recites some poems. She's got a real love for poetry. And then a year later, a publisher sends her a book called, quotes, The Seashells of the Eastern Seaboard by Catherine Daniel Clark. Within a year, she's managed to publish a book. She comments on developers building on the, quote, the murky swamp, her amazing swamp that she loved so much. And she's got a real distaste for this development. But she decides that she's going to try and secure her land legally. She visits Tate. She gives him the book that she's published. And there's a very touching scene where she also gives the book to Jump in. Now, my thoughts are, at this point, it seems very unlikely that she would publish a book. And did the author think that her main protagonist had to be, quote, successful? It seems slightly out of character in my mind that she would want to share her knowledge with people as well. But that's just my own thoughts. Anyway, carrying on, we go fast forward to the murder investigation. Ed and Joe question Jumpin and Tate, and they say Kaya was in Greenville with the publishers on the night of the murder, quite clearly. And Miss Pansy corroborates that. She says she sees her getting on the bus at 2:30 on the 28th and getting off at 1:15 on the 30th. But the police do say, look, maybe she made it look like an alibi. She came back late from Greenville in the evening and did the murder and bust back, which seems quite unlikely. Anyway, we go back in time. Jody returns. He's been in the military. Kaya recognises the scar on his face that Pa brutally gave, and we have a history of that, which is very sad. And Jodie tells her that her ma has died 2 years ago. So there goes one of my predictions, which I was hoping at the end of part 1 that hopefully I was thinking that she would see her mother again. But unfortunately, that is not to be. The letter that Pa burned was actually a request for the children to come to New Orleans. But Pa wrote back to Ma in these very clear terms, saying that if she contacted any of the children, quote, he would beat us unrecognisable. There's a lovely quote here. Ma loved us all her life, but was frozen in some horrible place of believing that we'd be harmed if she returned and abandoned if she didn't. She didn't leave us to have a fling. She'd been driven to madness and barely knew she'd left. Anyway, Jodie shows paintings that Ma made of her children, and one with her and Tate. And Kaya questions Ma, why didn't she send letters? I think the author made it quite clear that, quote, he would beat us unrecognisable, Pa, but Jodie goes on to say, quote, I guess some things can't be explained, just forgiven or not, end quote. And Jodie continues, if Tate came back, she's talking about Tate now, if Tate came back, apologised and says he loves you, maybe you should cut him a little slack. I think if Tate loves Kaya, it would be great if they could get together at this stage. It would be great. It'd be good for her. Anyway, going forward to the murder case, the police get into Kaya's shack and they're looking for certain evidence. So they're looking for these red fibres that they found on Chase's jacket, and a diary or calendar or some notes saying when she was out of town, or the shell necklace, or perhaps stubs from the night buses. They don't find anything except they do find the red wool hat, or / cap. It's sometimes called a cap, sometimes called a hat, which seems to be bad news, quite incriminating, I guess. At the time, I definitely thought, this is incriminating. But then, as we see later, we do find out that actually those fibres could have been put onto the jacket, up to 4 years prior to the murder. We go back to 1969, and I actually thought that the two timelines were coming together now, but they don't. They're still apart. Tate leaves a compass on the stump, and she sees him, but is too scared of abandonment, so she doesn't really make any contact with Tate. We fast forward. The police are considering now how to trap Kaya. They want to take her in for questioning, but she seems to be very elusive. Rodney Horn, a fisherman, says, quote, I saw something on the 30th, and Ed and Joe say, quote, let's get her in, end quote. So obviously he's seen something which is, we don't know what it is as the reader, but something obviously has been said, which is very important for the police. Anyway, the police catch her in the boat and they make an arrest. I think later we find out that she tried to escape, and so that's why she's held in jail. So we find Kaya in court, and the judge says, quote, the trial won't be moved due to local prejudices, because Mr. Milton, her lawyer, says that it might be unfair. And in court, perhaps the most memorable thing, I think, was the cat, Sunday Justice. Fantastic character in the book. Quote, Sunday Justice, the courthouse cat, his back black, his face white with a black mask around green eyes, stretched out in a puddle of sunlight in one of the deep windowsills. A courthouse fixture for years, he cleared the basement of rats and the courtroom of mice, earning his place. Carrying on, we hear a little bit more about him. We will begin the jury selection, Judge Sim says, turning towards the first 2 rows filled with potential jurors. As he read off a list of rules and conditions, Sunday Justice jumped down from the windowsill with a thud, and in one fluid motion leapt onto the judge's bench. Absent-mindedly, Judge Sim stroked the cat's head as he continued. I just love the character of Sunday Justice, and Kaya does as well, as we'll see later. Mrs. Culpepper is on the jury, and there's the horrible lady who used to call her Marsh Girl, so she's not too happy about that. Anyway, we go back in time to before the trial, before the murder. Kaya, after receiving the compass, bumps into Chase, and this is a real crucial moment in the story because he attempts to rape her, and 2 men stare at her as she escapes in the boat. And I've put a question here: are these Rodney and Denny? And it transpires that they are, because they make a claim that they saw her. The prosecutor is called Eric, and because there's no murder weapon, fingerprints or footprints, he doesn't even call the coroner. He just starts with the motive. So we start off with Rodney recounting the struggle with Chase and her saying, "Bother me again and I'll kill you." And he does agree with the defence that she could be running away when he sees her. We flip back in time. Kaya races back to her shack. She remembers Chase was wearing the necklace. Interestingly, Denny does say that he saw her on the morning of August the 30th, but Miss Pansy said she was out of town then, so something needs to be resolved there. At this point, she's fleeing to the reading cabin. She's just been attacked. She feels ashamed for having sex with Chase in that seedy motel, and she really understands how her mum must have felt. And quote, "I will never live like that, a life wondering when and where the next fist will fall." As she's escaping to the reading cabin, she does see a mantis eating her lover. More on that later. It seems to be teaching her, as we see throughout the novel, nature is her educator. And again, in this second half, we have lots of examples of nature educating Kaya. We fast forward to the trial. Kaya is held in a cell for 2 months before the trial because she tried to escape the police and no one's offered to pay her bail. Why Jodie or anyone else haven't, doesn't really get covered. And then we go back. So Tate invites bruised, battered Kaya aboard his boat to see this new microscope that he's got, and he persuades her to meet this editor, but she's worried about taking the bus, and he flings a red cap at her, his red cap, for the cold, because it's quite cold, but she flings it back, and then they fling it backwards and forwards, and it's not really clear who ends up with the red cap. Presumably it's Kaya, but as we already know, that's going to be important in the trial. Later in the day, she spies Chase and she hides from him. She's just so scared. Then we jump forward again to the murder case. So she's in jail and she refuses Tate's visits or to call Jodie, and she can't pay bail. Tom Milton, really friendly lawyer, really nice guy, he's come out of retirement to do this job pro bono because he thinks that she's innocent, says, quote, "Plead guilty to manslaughter. Say he accidentally fell off the tower and you may get a lighter sentence." But Kaya says, quote, "No, I will not go to jail." So she's adamant, and that makes us as the reader think that she's innocent as well, I think. Anyway, Mabel and Jumpin send her a heartwarming package, some drawing things, some shells, and then we've got this lovely example of nature giving her comfort. Sunday Justice, my favourite character in the whole book, probably. Certainly Kaya's favourite character, I think. Quote, "Then something moved on the hall floor just outside the bars of her jail. Her eyes swung there. Sunday Justice sat on his haunches staring at her dark eyes with his green ones. Her heart raced, locked up alone all these weeks, and now this creature could step wizard-like between the bars, be with her. Sunday Justice broke the stare and looked down the hall towards the inmates' talk. Kaya was terrified that he would leave her and walk to them, but he looked back at her, blinked in obligatory boredom, and squeezed easily between the bars inside. Kaya breathed out, whispered, 'Please stay.' Taking his time, he sniffed his way around the cell, researching the damp cement walls, the exposed pipes and the sink, all the while compelled to ignore her. A small crack in the wall was the most interesting to him. She knew because he flicked his thoughts on his tail. He ended his tour next to the small bed. Then, just like that, he jumped onto her lap and circled, his large white paws finding soft purchase on her thighs. Kaya sat frozen, her arms slightly raised so as not to interfere with his manoeuvring. Finally, he settled as though he had nested here every night of his life. He looked at her. Gently she touched his head, then scratched his neck. A loud purr erupted like a current. She closed her eyes at such easy acceptance, a deep pause and a lifetime of longing. Afraid to move, she sat stiff until her leg cramped, then shifted slightly to stretch her muscles. Sunday Justice, without opening his eyes, slid off her lap and curled up next to her side. She lay down, fully clothed, and they both nestled in. She watched him sleep, then followed, not falling toward a jolt, but a drifting, finally into an empty calm. Carrying on, Jacob, who's this lovely prison guard, helps Kaya to see more of Sunday Justice. And then Tate visits, and she says, look, forget me, I'm not part of your world. Which is quite an interesting reversal, because earlier in the novel, Tate decided she wasn't part of his world. I don't know whether you remember this quote. I'll read it to you again. He'd been at college less than, this is chapter 22, he'd been at college less than 2 months, but he had already stepped directly into the world he wanted, analysing the stunning symmetry of the DNA molecule, as if he'd crawled inside a glistening cathedral of coiling atoms and climbed the winding acidic rungs of the helix. Goes on, Kaya's mind could easily live there, but she could not. Kaya, I just can't do this, he whispered, I'm sorry. So he rejects her. Anyway, he's changed his mind about her. That's for sure. And with regard to how she's going to get off, I just at this stage I just don't know. How did those red fibres end up on his body? That's my big question. It was answered actually, because they could have happened at any point in the last 4 years. But anyway, that's what I'm considering at this time. We continue with the trial sort of period of time. Judge Sims gets rid of segregation in his courthouse, and that makes us all think, yes, he's a good man. And Jump and Mabel are in court. The coroner states that Chase died between 00 hours and 200 hours on the 30th, so the morning of the 30th. The coroner's called Dr. Stewart, and he states that he fell backwards through the hole, he may have been pushed, and that the fibres on his jacket matched the cap found in Kaya's shack. So I'm thinking there's got to be a link between the red cap here and the gull called Red Cap, or is it just a coincidence? Probably just a coincidence, but she does mention Red Cap, and I don't know, it just... Maybe email me, tell me if I've missed anything there. The defence causes the coroner to agree that there is no evidence that Chase was pushed. It seems obvious to me at that time that he wasn't pushed. Anyway, Tom says, quote, those fibres could have been on that jacket for a year, even 4 years, and the coroner agrees. He says, correct. Kaya considers phoning Jodie, but is too ashamed. She holds the compass to her heart, and it reminds her of a poem. She whispered Emily Dickinson's words, the sweeping up the heart and putting love away, we shall not want to use again until eternity. And that poem really reminded me of a poem called Stop the Clocks by Auden. We're going back in time now, back to September 1969. She's excited to meet this editor, and Robert Foster, who is the editor, is really into these sort of poetic descriptions of nature. Quote, for more than 2 years they had exchanged short notes and even some long letters, mostly discussing editorial adjustments for the prose and art in her books, but the correspondence, written so often in biological phrases, blended with poetic descriptions, had become a bond welded in its own language. She wanted to meet this person on the other end of the mail line, who knew how ordinary light is shattered by microscopic prisms in the feathers of hummingbirds, creating the iridescence of its golden red throat, and how to say it in words as startling as the colours. That little quote there really reminds me of her love for this book by this guy called Aldo Leopold, A Sand County Almanac. If we go back to the first half of the book, it's in an early chapter 17. Quote, for the rest of summer, Kaya and Tate did the reading lessons at the Tumbledown cabin. By mid-August, they had read through A Sand County Almanac, and although she couldn't read every word, she got most of it. Aldo Leopold taught her that floodplains are living extensions of the rivers, which will claim them back any time they choose. Anyone living on a floodplain is just waiting in the river's wings. She learned where the geese go in winter and the meaning of their music. His soft words sound almost like poetry, taught her that soil is packed with life and one of the most precious riches on earth, that draining wetlands dries the land for miles beyond, killing plants and animals along with the water. Some of the seeds lie dormant in the desiccated earth for decades, waiting, and when the water finally comes home again, they burst through the soil, unfolding their faces. Wonders and real-life knowledge she would never learn in school. Carrying on, she tells Jumpin that Chase attacked her. because he noticed the bruising, and it's still visible a month later. And Jumpin does offer his support, and he even offers his home if she feels under threat from Chase. We go forward to the trial again. Tom cross-examines the sheriff, and he concludes that the tide could have washed away the footprints rather than being deliberately covered up, and that there's no evidence to put Kaya at the scene. And the sheriff, only 3 months earlier, wrote complaining to the Forest Service about the safety of the grates at the top of the tower. And at this stage, I'm still thinking, look, we don't know where or who has the necklace. That is really crucial. We need to find that out. Anyway, if we go back, and she leaves to see the editor in Greenville on the 2:30 bus. And I was just thinking, Denny said he saw her early morning of the 30th, so why did she come back early? Question mark. And the narrator does say she returned on the 30th at 1:16. The narrator does not mention that she comes back on the night of the 29th. So either the narrator is being naughty and not telling us all the truth, or she genuinely didn't come back to murder Chase. And also I'm thinking the shrimper called Miller, as I presume, did not see the Marsh girl motoring out to the far tower the night Chase died. It could have been anyone. Anyway, Jumpin tells Kaya the body of Chase has been found. And this is after she comes back. And, I can't see how the police could have had any evidence of foul play. Do they think that the body was drugged up and dropped? Or do they think that she lured him up and pushed him? I guess that's it, but it does seem unlikely. Anyway, going forward to the trial, Tom shows up some silly suggestions that Kaya was disguised coming back to the Cove on night of the murder in the night bus from Greenville. And then there's a journal that's shown in court as evidence that shows that Kaya was giving a necklace on top of this fire tower. Patty Love confirms Chase wore the necklace constantly and had it on the night of the murder, but didn't have it in the coroner's. So yeah, there's this sort of bizarre picture of her giving Chase this necklace, which is sort of a strange present to have given to Chase. Anyway, more questions. I was thinking, are we going to see Miller's evidence smashed to bits that he saw the Marsh girl go towards the tower at midnight? Miller says she was boating towards the far tower at 1:45. And for a start, if Chase died at 0-100 to 200 hours, why would she be motoring toward the far tower at 1:45? And Miller confesses that it might not have been Kaya doing that. Anyway, the prosecution accepts that she got on the bus and got off at the time stated. And Lang Furlow testifies that Kaya stayed at his, quote, Three Mountains motel from the 28th to the 30th of October, and that he didn't see her leave. And Scupper joins the courtroom. And Robert Foster, her editor, also testifies that he took her back to the motel at 9:55 on the 29th. And she really feels angry that he's got involved. She was trying to keep her reputation in the editorial publishing world sort of really good, clean, and then her editor's there. So I'm thinking, surely it's over. There's not any case to begin with. Anyway, the prosecution state that her decision to stay at the motel rather than a hotel is because it's close to a bus station for returning to murder. But the defence says no, it's because, according to Robert Foster, she doesn't like big crowds, and as a loner, unused to cities, a motel near a bus station would be less stressful for her. And then the defence and prosecution questioned the sheriff about whether there would be a time to commit the murder once Kaya's bus had got in. Doesn't seem there would be much. And when are they going to bring in the necklace, I'm thinking? Anyway, O'Neill, who was in Miller's boat, says it was too dark to say whether it was Kaya in the other boat. And then we have some closing statements from the prosecution and the defence. And then the jurors spend ages deliberating, but finally they come up with the decision that she is not guilty. She spurns consolation from Jodie, and Kaya watches the sheriff take away Tate. So, did he murder Chase? Tate's out in the boat, and Kaya sees from her cabin him racing across the water, and then him looking very forlorn as he's dragged onto the sheriff's boat. But then we as the reader think, oh my God, he's going to be had up in court now for murdering Chase. That would be terrible. But it's actually just a cheap trick, Delia, cheap trick, because Tate's father, Scupper, has died, and the sheriff was just coming to tell him, and all he was doing was just taking him away in his boat. Anyway, Kaya and Tate do ultimately declare their love for each other. and Tate moves into Kaya's shack. And they have this sickeningly idyllic life together. Just have a listen to this. Quote, each morning they rose at dawn, and while Tate percolated coffee, Kaya fried corn fritters in Ma's old iron skillet, blackened and dented, or stirred grits and eggs as sunrise eased over the lagoon, the heron posing one-legged in the mist. They cruised estuaries, waded waterways, and slipped through narrow streams, collecting feathers and amoebas. In the evenings they drifted in her old boat until sunset, then swam naked in moonlight or loved in beds of cool ferns. There we go. Idyllic, hey? And then there's a series of deaths. First of all, Jumpin dies. Kaya's very upset. She says, quote, he was my pa. At this time, I'm thinking, and I've written this in my comments, the ending's going on too long here. Please leave something to my imagination. Can't we just end the novel now? And then she's incredibly successful again. Quote, Tate continued his job at the lab, and Kaya published 7 more award-winning books. And though she was granted many accolades, including an honorary doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she never once accepted the invitations to speak at universities and museums. The fact that she is successful is out of character. I don't think she would be the sort of person to be winning 7 more award-winning books. Maybe she would be. I don't know. She just doesn't seem like that kind of person. But anyway, Kaya and Tate ultimately can't have a family, and then Kaya dies at 64, so we have the death of Kaya as well. And now I'm thinking, look, come on, give the reader some room to use their own imagination. It's like, the author can't let go of her character. She has to have total control, and some of the writing at this point is a bit over the top. There's a quote of him saying, Kaya, no, he screamed. And then the author's so determined to have the last word, she even gives the grave marker. So, quote, Catherine Daniel Clark, Kaya, the Marsh Girl, 1945 to 2009. Talk about having complete control over your character's whole life, which is fine, I guess. She's the author, she can do what she wants. But, letting her live in my imagination, I was really looking forward to just thinking about her life away from the novel, I guess. Anyway, Tate discovers a box of Amanda Hamilton's poetry, and he realised that actually Kaya was this Amanda Hamilton person whose poems are sort of peppered throughout the book. And at this point, I'm thinking, wouldn't it have been great if he, instead of finding poetry in the box, he had found, he'd opened a box and he discovered a fake wig, a mask, the shell necklace, and maybe a bus ticket with the time 12 midnight on the 29th. And I kind of wrote this in the side of the book in a kind of joking way, but then 2 paragraphs later, there's a poem that basically incriminates Kaya completely, and the necklace. So I read the poem and it all makes sense now. So there is that big twist. So ultimately the truth did not out the actual truth, that she killed Chase. And personally I find it slightly unsettling. How could Kaya live with that secret for so long, and now how can Tate live with that secret? And what about all the work that Tom Milton and the judge did on her behalf? The ending feels a bit kind of tacked on, or maybe there were a few endings and this was kind of the best or most exciting twist. I just don't know whether it follows the natural path of the character, and I don't think Kaya would have murdered Chase. What he did was excessive, but I can't imagine her murdering him in cold blood because of it. I think certainly in self-defense she could have murdered him, but in cold blood I don't think so. So anyway, let's just look at those questions that we had at the end of the first half of the novel. If I just go back to them. So the first was, did Kaya kill Chase? And I said no. Well, quite clearly she did. Will Kaya find love? Yes, ultimately Tate and her got, in quotes, married. And then will Kaya's mother return? Unfortunately she didn't. That's very sad that she died. And will Pa or brothers, sisters return? No, we don't hear from Pa or the sisters. We do obviously hear from Jodie. And who has the shell necklace? And I've put here, at the end of the last podcast, I put Kaya because she liked it. And there's also a clue. But I put here, she may have taken it from him many days before the murder, if it was murder. But no, she didn't, because she murdered him. Anyway, yeah, so they're the questions. Thinking on a bit longer, Tom Milton and Robert Foster, they worked hard to get her off, and she did it all along. And what about poor Patty Love? Yeah, well, she wasn't a very nice person. She called her, I think, marsh trash. But, you know, she lost the son, and I feel sorry for Patty Love, that she didn't really get any justice. She's probably still grieving for her son. In the author's defence, the shell necklace did need to be resolved somehow. But she could have maybe left it open in some way. Maybe the necklace snagged as he fell, disappearing into the mud. And why did she need the shell necklace? Why did she want that? I mean, maybe it was she was so angry with him that she wanted closure on that part. And why wasn't she questioned by the prosecutor? All Eric needed to say was, "Look, Kaya, do you know where the shell necklace is? Or what were you doing on the night of the 29th?" We didn't get those questions. And anyway, my feelings overall, would I recommend the novel? Depends on the person. Would you recommend it? Certainly the descriptions of nature, which continues through the second half of the novel. Fantastic. The praying mantis, or the female mantis eating the lover, is a fantastic one, where she's learning from nature. Quote, "After a simple meal of hard bread and smoked fish, she sat on the edge of her porch bed, staring through the screen. Just at that moment, she noticed a female praying mantis stalking along a branch near her face. The insect was plucking moths with her articulated forelegs, then chewing them up, their wings still flapping in her mouth. A male mantis, head high and proud as a pony, paraded along to court her. She appeared interested, her antennae flailing about like wands. His embrace might have been tight or tender, Kaya couldn't tell, but while he probed about with his copulatory organ to fertilise her eggs, the female turned back her long, elegant neck and bit off his head. He was so busy humping he didn't notice. His neck stump waved about as he continued his business, and she nibbled on his thorax, and then his wings. Finally, his last foreleg protruded from her mouth as his headless, heartless lower body copulated in perfect rhyme. Female fireflies draw in strange males with dishonest signals and eat them. Mantis females devour their own mates. Female insects, Kaya thought, know how to deal with their lovers." Just like she did at the end of the novel. An example where she uses the knowledge learnt from nature is in the courtroom. Quote, "The language of the court was, of course, not as poetic as the language of the marsh, yet Kaya saw similarities in their natures. The judge, obviously the alpha male, was secure in his position, so his posture was imposing but relaxed and unthreatened as the territorial boar. Tom Milton, too, exuded confidence and rank with easy movements and stance. A powerful buck, acknowledged as such. The prosecutor, on the other hand, relied on wide, bright ties and broad-shouldered suit jackets to enhance his status. He threw his weight by flinging his arms or raising his voice. A lesser male needs to shout to be noticed. The bailiff represented the lowest ranking male and depended on his belt hung with glistening pistol, clanging wad of keys and clunky radio to bolster his position. Dominance hierarchies enhanced stability in natural populations and some less natural," Kaya thought. And then we've got the narrator summarising exactly how Kaya's learned. On page 363, right at the end of the novel, we've got this wonderful quote from the narrator. Quote, "Most of what she knew," Kaya that is, "she'd learned from the wild. Nature had nurtured, tutored and protected her when no one else would." And I think that is the key sentence, or a couple of sentences in the whole book. Basically, Kaya has learned everything she knows from nature because she was rejected by so many people and school. And then after reading the book, I mentioned in the last podcast this idea of dramatic irony, the characters not knowing what we, the readers, know, and that's flipped here. This time it's us who are blinded by the narrator. For example, after the trial, the narrator says, quote, "As time passed, most everyone agreed the sheriff never should have arrested her. After all, there was no hard evidence against her, no real proof of a crime." And that's the narrator speaking. She goes on, or he goes on. "And though Kaya was never completely healed from the scorn and suspicion surrounding her, a soft contentment and near happiness settled into her. healed. I mean, that's a strong word to use. The other thing is that Tate was very busy with Kaya when she was in jail. Quote, during all those months pining for Kaya, then trying to visit her in jail, he'd spent almost no time with Scupper. Guilt and regret needed clawing away. He had not been so obsessed with his own heart, perhaps he would have noticed his father's failing. So because he spent all this time dealing with Kaya, he's actually missed out on precious time with his father just before he died. And the not mentioning the bus journeys. Why does the author or narrator fail to mention the secret bus journeys? Quote, she stood on the corner under the bus stop sign and waited until the Trailways bus, its air brakes hissing, pulled out, blocking the ocean. Nobody got off or on as Kaya stepped forward and bought a ticket to Greenville from the driver. When she asked about the return dates and times, he handed her a printed schedule and then stowed her suitcase. She tightly held her knapsack and boarded. And before she had time to think much about it, the bus, which seemed as long as the town, drove out of Berkeley Cove. 2 days later, at 1:16 in the afternoon, Kaya stepped off the Trailways from Greenville. At no point does the narrator mention the other bus journeys. So I don't know what you call inverse dramatic irony, but we definitely had some of that. And another interesting thing I thought in the novel was this split forward-backward timeline by using these reminiscences or daydreams. For example, the favourite picnic with Tate that she's thinking of when she's in court, and then the journal for Chase that she's thinking about, and the fact that she never had a pet. All these little thoughts that she's having in court that act as kind of daydreams also help us keep those two timelines going, even when the two timelines meet. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the actual author now. So Delia Owens, I didn't know much about her, and I didn't really want to know much about her until I'd finished the book. She's an American author and zoologist. This is her debut novel, and it's topped the New York Times best fiction bestsellers for 25 non-consecutive weeks. But she's also written memoirs called Cry of the Kalahari and The Eye of the Elephant, and Secrets of the Savannah, with her then husband Mark, about their time studying animals in Africa. She grew up in rural Georgia in the 1950s. She and her husband, Mark Owens, were students in biology at the University of Georgia. She earned a bachelor's science degree in zoology from the University of Georgia in 1974 and worked in the Kalahari Desert. Since completing her PhD in biology, she's published her studies of African wildlife, and she's also contributed articles to Natural History. That's why the depictions of nature are so well done, and the process of nature. I would now like to talk about the book that we're going to read together for next month. It's called The Moon and the Bonfire by Cesare Pavese. This is recommended by a very good friend of mine who said it's one of his favourite books. So I'm going to read maybe just the first couple of pages. I don't know anything about Pavese. Italian, that's all I know. There is a bit of biography at the front. Born in 1908 in Piedmont. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and just first impressions, just see how it goes. So this is the first time I've read it. Okay, chapter 1. There is a reason why I came back to this place, came back here instead of to Canelli, Barbaresco or Alba. It is almost certain that I was not born here. Where I was born I don't know. There is not a house or a bit of ground or a handful of dust hereabouts of which I can say, this was me before I was born. I do not know whether I come from the hills or from the valleys, from the woods, or from a great house with a balcony. Maybe the girl who laid me on the cathedral steps in Alba didn't come from the country either. Maybe her people had a big house in town. Anyhow, I was carried there in the kind of basket they use at the grape harvest by two poor women from Monticello or Neve, or perhaps from Gravenanza. Why not? Who knows whose flesh and blood I am? I have knocked about the world enough to know that one lot of flesh and blood is as good as another. But that's why you get tired and try to put down roots, to find somewhere where you belong, so you're worth more than the usual round of the seasons and last a bit longer. I think I'll leave it there. What a fantastic opening to a novel. I wonder where he comes from then. I really hope you have enjoyed reading Where the Crawdads Sings. I will join you next podcast for an in-depth look at The Moon and the Bonfire by Cesare Pavese. Have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see you at the next podcast.